Hello everybody, and welcome back to our series on microphone placement. And today we're going to look at stereo techniques for microphones. Up until now we've been using one mic at varying distances and excuse me, varying placements to achieve different sounds. Today we're going to look at capturing basically what your ears hear in a room. Your ears are stereo, so you'll hear sounds coming from various different parts of the room. And the setup of a stereo arrangement of mics is designed for you to capture that same experience in your recordings. And there are three flavors we're going to look at today. The first one is probably the most intuitive one that you might expect. It's, if you think of your ears being two microphones spaced on either side of your head, then if you look at the way these mics are arranged here, they're spaced apart from each other. And they're also, you'll notice, the same height from the ground and the same height from our sound source, which today is going to be a drum kit. Let's talk a wee bit about the placement and the distance. But before we do that, we're going to look at just the neat way that the cables are tidily wrapped around the stand, which you all should be aware of by now. And we're also going to look at the settings on the microphone itself, because they are multi-pattern condenser mics, the SET2s. So I've just got them on cardioid, each of them on cardioid with no filters on them, because we're recording an entire drum kit, so we'll want all the bass that we can get from the kick drum. And there are no pads on it either. It's just recording naturally. So basically as clean a recording as we can get with no added EQ. And the idea is that we'll record the drum kit using three different arrangements of mics, stereo arrangements of mics, and you can then compare the three recordings and pick out the differences between them, and that should inform your selection of mic technique for your own recordings. So to start with, distance from the sound source. There's no right and there's no wrong answer for this. For a drum kit, it would make very little sense to put these mics 1 foot away from the kit here, because obviously this one would be picking up all snare drum, this one would be picking up all ride cymbal. So a sensible distance would be, a sensible minimum distance would be about what we have here, which is about 6 feet. Now remember that if you're in a nice sounding room with a good reverberation, you can move these further back and capture more of the room sound. And indeed, one of the things that we will look at in future classes is multi-micing the kit with single mics on each drum, and also using a stereo pair like this in the room to add ambience. But for now, we're just going to try and capture the kit as much as we can, or as close to the kit as we can, so that we get as much of the dry sound, and we're not really worried too much about the room. Hence, the kit is back in the acoustically treated area of the studio. Okay, so yeah, about 6 feet. And the next question is the height. Where should the microphones be in height? Now, you've probably seen lots of pictures of drum kits with a stereo arrangement of mics here above the cymbals, right and left, and that's fine if you just want to capture the cymbals. But because we don't have a mic on the kick drum, we need to actually capture some of that as well using the same stereo pair. So I've made a compromise height, and again, you can experiment with this. If you want more kick in your mix, just drop the level down so that the mics are closer to the kick. If you want more cymbals, raise them up a bit. The only thing to be aware of is that the closer you have them to the ground, obviously, the more reflections can actually reach the mic as well as the direct sound. Okay, so whilst it's not an ideal scenario compared to stereo room mics and close mics, it still gets the job done. Okay. And you may be surprised actually how good a sound you can get with just 1 or 2 mics on a full kit, if the drummer's good. Okay, so that's what we call an AB, or a spaced pair. Okay, so I've got them, well, probably maybe 1.5 feet apart, and 6 feet from the kit is a good starting point. You can also experiment with widening the mics out moving them 2 feet away, or narrowing the gap between them to maybe 1 foot. What you would expect to happen there is the wider that you move them apart, the wider your stereo image becomes in your final recording. Okay. We'll talk a wee bit more whenever you do this practical yourself about how we actually manipulate the sound then once we have it recorded. Okay, but you would expect that whenever you record, this one gets panned all the way to the left, this one gets panned all the way to the right, and when you bring that up in your faders, you'll hear quite a wide stereo image compared to the other two arrangements that we're going to look at. Okay. Some of the disadvantages maybe of this technique compared to the other ones we're going to look at is, as I've said, the wider they are spaced apart, the wider your stereo image. But what that actually tends to do is leave a hole in the center sometimes. So if I was recording a drum kit with a stereo pair, I probably wouldn't use this arrangement. I would reserve this for something like maybe a choir, where there are different sections of the choir, altos, sopranos, tenors, whatever, and you really want to accentuate that width. For a drum kit, remember, if you think about how a drum kit's mixed, your kick and snare tend to be center of the mix. So you want a real strong central image. So you may, again, when you analyze the 3 recordings that we're going to do, you might hear that there's not as solid a central image from this technique. But it still works very well. Okay, I think that's all I need to say about the spaced pair. So we'll do a wee recording and then we'll reset up for the next one, which is a coincident pair, or XY. And welcome back. Now we're going to look at the second stereo arrangement, which we call XY, or coincident pair. And if you have a look at the mics here, you'll see that they are, when we say coincident, it means that they're in the same point in space as much as possible. So remember, the diaphragm, the part of the mic that picks up sound, is this part behind the grill. And the way we've arranged these 2 mics is the front of this one is pointing towards the right-hand side of the kit. The front of this one is pointing towards the left-hand side of the kit. So they are going to create the stereo image for left and right when they're combined. The great advantage of this particular arrangement is that it creates what we talked about in the last video, which is a real stable central image. So you get very good mono compatibility. In other words, there's no phase difference between the 2 microphones. Remember, if you think about phase, when we talked about phase problems in recording, phase problems occur whenever we use more than 1 microphone on the same sound source. And specifically when the 2 microphones or 3 microphones are at different distances from the sound source, because the sound wave arriving at the microphone at different times when added together creates phase problems, or phase cancellation of particular frequencies. The thing about this arrangement is that if you take any part of the drum kit, let's say the kick drum, a sound wave arriving from here will arrive at both microphones at exactly the same time. Therefore, there can't be any phase problems, as much as possible. I mean, they're pretty much as close as we can get them. And you also get that stable, central, strong mono image for your kick and your snare. Although your snare will be slightly off center, because just due to the placement of it on the kit, it's slightly off to one side. But generally, it's a much more stable arrangement and very much probably would be my preferred arrangement. If I was just using two mics on a kit, this is probably the one I would choose rather than the spaced pair for the reasons stated. Okay, the polar patterns are the same. The filters are nothing's changed on the microphone settings. Nothing has changed on the height. We're above the same spot. We're actually above the central spot, which would have been the central spot between the two spaced pairs. That was where I've placed the mics this time. Okay, so let's have a listen to this one and see if you can spot any difference in particularly the stereo width, the stereo image that is created. We're going to play the same piece, same drummer, and so don't worry about the kit, which isn't in the, we haven't tuned it or anything, but that's not what we're listening for. We're listening for the stereo effect of this arrangement of microphones. Okay. Hello and welcome back to the third arrangement of stereo microphones that we're going to look at today. This one is called ORTF, developed by French radio engineers, I think, back in the 1950s. The lovely thing about this technique, it combines some of the best parts of both the coincident XY technique and the spaced pair AB technique. You can see that the microphones are spaced, but they also are angled out. So it's got the angling of the XY technique to capture the left and right sides, and it's also got the space of the AB technique, or an element of the space of the AB technique, not as much, to capture the phase differences as well, the stereo information that is obtained through phase difference. Okay, so couple of things that you need to remember about this technique. The microphones themselves, you can see they're on this stereo bar, which is a very handy item, so you can put two mics on one stand. They should be 17 centimeters apart. So you should measure that when you get a bit more experience. I know that the distance between my finger and my middle of my thumb is 17 centimeters, so I can measure it pretty accurately doing that these days. And also the angle should be 110 degrees between these mics. So if you make an angle there and there, that should be slightly wider than a right angle. Now again, you can experiment with that angle and make it a bit more narrow or a bit wider, but generally 110 is the one for true ORTF. Okay, so 17 centimeters apart, 110 degrees angled apart, and you should get the same stereo image, but with a slightly, the same width as the AB pair, but with a slightly more solid central image, similar to the XY pair. And this is called ORTF. I don't know if I mentioned in the last video, but in an XY, the angle is variable. In an XY pair, we normally would start at 90 degrees, but that is also variable. You can widen the image out by changing the angle out the ways and narrow it in by bringing the mics in closer towards each other. Okay, so let's try this one. So just to recap, we've looked at 3 stereo techniques. We've looked at AB or spaced pair, we've looked at XY or coincident pair, and we've looked at ORTF, which is a near coincident pair, so it's got an element of both. Now you'll choose a technique dependent on the sound source you're trying to record and the type of stereo image you're trying to achieve. Typical applications would be a drum kit, a choir, an orchestra, or even if you've got a singer-songwriter with just a guitar and vocal in a nice sounding acoustic space, experiment with a stereo pair just to capture the ambience of how it sounds in the room. You can try things like a spaced pair on a piano. If you open the lid of a piano, you can put one side and one the other. You can even go as far as doing things like acoustic guitar, one on the body, one on the neck, or XY, somewhere near the sound hole or near where the neck meets the body. There's a million applications of stereo miking, and as I said at the start, the idea is that you capture basically what your ears are hearing in the room at the time. So it's not a point source like a single mic that we've used in previous classes. So have a listen to all 3 examples that we've recorded and see if you can pick out the differences, and good luck with your own stereo experiments.